You know, there's no greater responsibility the House of Representatives has but to manage and control the nation's finances, the nation's ability to meet our obligations, to appropriately fund our government when necessary, and only when necessary to borrow to meet those obligations. And the greatest reflection of where the people are politically is the House of Representatives. It's proportionate across the country, each person across the country equally represented by their member of Congress. And the American people gave us the majority back in November because we ran on fiscal responsibility. We ran on combating the Biden agenda. We ran against the reckless spending, the unprecedented amount of spending. For the first time in the history of the country, $10 trillion of new government spending in the first 2 years of administration. Now a record $32 trillion in national debt, approximately $100,000 per American citizen. We will spend this year about $20,000 per American citizen, only about 15% of which, only about $3,000 per citizen of which will be for the primary responsibility of the federal government, which is the safety and security of the nation. And back in January, when this new Congress formed, when we voted in a speaker, there was an agreement to go back to pre-COVID level spending for non-defense discretionary spending. This Republican majority was united for the first 5 months of the year, passing strong Republican legislation. That's what the country gave us the majority to do, to pass Republican legislation to reverse the harmful policies of the Biden, Schumer, and then Pelosi agenda. We passed the Limit, Save, Grow, which was a significant step towards fiscal responsibility, had lots of good components to it, like the H.R. 1 energy bill, the H.R. 2 border bill, and eliminating much of the Biden reckless, woke agenda that's harming the country. And then we passed the Fiscal Responsibility Act, or what I call the Failed Responsibility Act. We failed the American people with the FRA, which essentially kept in place all the Biden spending. Everyone who voted for that bill essentially owned the Biden agenda, the Biden spending, for the remaining 1.5 years of this Congress. However, it was said by leadership at that time that we will use the appropriations process, that the FRA was the ceiling, not the floor. But we would go back to pre-COVID level spending for non-defense discretionary, and we're calling on Republicans to do that very thing. Sadly and unfortunately, there are some Republicans in the House who don't want to cut spending. Worse yet, many Republicans in the Senate want to actually increase spending. But we are committed to using every tool at our disposal to going back to the 1.471 pre-COVID level spending for non-defense discretionary, allowing defense to stay at the current levels. And my colleagues behind us and our friends at the Freedomworks are united in doing that. That the Republican appropriations bills ought to implement Republican priorities, reversing the reckless, harmful, dangerous policy of the Biden administration, and take a step towards putting us on fiscal responsibility.
This is the beginning of the spending fights. We're not even talking about entitlements yet. We're just talking about making some steps, some first steps in getting our spending under control. Admiral Mullins a few years ago, when talking about the greatest threat to the United States, it wasn't Russia, it wasn't China, it was our debt and deficit, it was our spending.
We are going to, in the next 16 days, you'll see it play out, where we examine all the 12 appropriation bills and let the American people decide, are we being unreasonable? The problem with Washington, D.C., the reason it's broken, every dollar spent has got an advocate for it. The problem is we need an advocate for the American taxpayer, and that's what we're going to do.
When we passed the Limit, Save, and Grow Act earlier this year, we made a commitment to the American people. We were going to reduce spending. We were going to freeze the spending levels. And we were going to make sure that we removed all of the woke spending programs that the Biden administration has put forward over the last couple of years out of the spending. Because that's what the American people sent us forward to do. And the only way that we're going to be able to make sure that we do that is if we see all 12 of these appropriation bills totaled up so we know what the total spending is. If the leadership believes that they're going to be able to trickle these out 2 at a time, 3 a week, 4 a week, that's just not going to be feasible because we will never be able to see what the total spending is until the very end. And when we then try to uphold our commitment, our word to the American people that we will not push spending beyond the $1.471 trillion for non-defense discretionary. And if we have one piece of legislation left that we have to try and make up 50, 60, 70 billion dollars, that's not going to be acceptable. We want to see all 12 of the appropriation bills. We want leadership to uphold their end of the deal. And that way, 218 members of Congress that voted to curb spending, to rein in spending, can actually get the job done. I heard the minority leader speak last week when we passed the National Defense Authorization Act. And he said, you know, this is woefully irresponsible. It's woefully irresponsible. It was woefully irresponsible what they've been doing for the last 2 decades. They have gutted out our military, and then they wonder why as they sit in their rooms and look at each other and see why is the recruitment numbers down across the board. That's why. Because the brave young men and women that have the ability and the desire to defend our country are concerned about the people that are actually running the enterprise, the mechanism that's going to help them do that.
Even if you move to the 2022 levels of spending for discretionary funding for non-military spending, that $1.8 trillion in spending will be borrowed. Every penny of that will be borrowed. So that you're looking at $32 trillion in national debt today. A year from now, it will be in excess of $34.5 trillion because as we finish out the fiscal year and move on. That's what you're looking at, the national debt, which is a threat to our national security for many reasons. And I encourage my colleagues to join me, and I call upon the Speaker to bring my bill, the national debt is a security threat, to the floor. $1.8 trillion more in national debt, ladies and gentlemen. That's why I have staunchly encouraged us to go back to 2019 discretionary levels across the board. Wouldn't it be nice if for just 3 months or 6 months we didn't spend more than we brought in every month? But on average, we spend about $125 billion more every month than we bring in revenue. And that's even when we had record revenue. It's not a revenue problem here. It is a spending problem. And the only way we get it under control is to have the courage to say, you know what, in 2019, pre-COVID, nobody was saying, gee, we're underfunded. We're too small as a federal government. Nobody was saying that. So why not get back to those 2019 levels?